somewhere in the brain, not only can we have psychological responses, stimulus, interpretation, response, but that conditioning, that learning, so when I say conditioning, I mean learning in the brain, stimulus, interpretation, response, can also occur for physical illnesses as well. So this idea of neuroplasticity, and we've talked about it, and different speakers have mentioned it, this idea that the map is not the territory in NLP. So you know your Google Maps, right? So you're thinking, okay, let me decide where I'm going, and you follow Google Maps, and it takes you down some strange road, right? Then it claims there's a road continuing, and suddenly it's blocked off. And you think, oh gosh, right? It doesn't happen so much now, but I think in the early days of Google it used to happen. Yeah? So the territory around you is different to the map that you've created. So your brain is constantly creating an internal map, like Alex mentioned yesterday, right? Your brain is filling in 80 to 90% of the gaps in the information that you're taking in. You take a small bit of information in, because it's too overwhelming for the brain. So the brain fills in the rest of the gaps. Yeah? And what happens there is, when the brain is doing that, not only can it make errors, but the brain is also designed to be quick and dirty. Yeah? Now what that means is, the brain says, okay, well if that happened 5 times before, it's probably going to happen again, so I'll just use the same response. Because it's quicker and easier than trying to learn this new response again. Yeah? So let me put that in context. What's the biggest question of all? Why are we here? We're here because, from a scientific perspective, this body, this nervous system, has evolved and adapted over millions of years through plant life, invertebrates, vertebrates, mammals, to get us to where we are today. And in fact, our DNA contains a lot of the DNA of all the animals up to this point. Yeah? So we are survival machines. So the number one priority of this brain, this body, this nervous system, is to protect us from danger, enable survival, so we can pass on our genes to the next generation. Your body doesn't care whether you feel good, whether you feel well. Its number one priority is survival. And I want to make this case that the way that we're living in modern society now has meant that these survival responses have now become primed to become chronic. Yeah? And why could that be? Our modern way of living is increasing this inflammatory bias, this idea that there are threats constantly in the environment, and we need to trigger the nervous system, the immune system, to protect us, mildly in the background. And I call the 4 factors of health the MEND protocol. M is for mind, E is for exercise, N is for nighttime routine, and D is for diet. So in a lot of the research that we do at the clinic, those 4 aspects, when I say diet, I'm also including supplements and everything like that, kind of 4 key components. And the mind, in my view, is actually the most important. Yeah? And some of you in your clinics will find actually some of the other aspects may be different for different people. Yeah? But in our clinic, that's what we mainly focus on, but we also focus on the other ones as well. Yeah? So the way that we're living, the stress, the pollutants, the food we're eating, the comparison that we're constantly having with other people, the stress of modern life, and our phones and our devices never allowing us to relax this nervous system is priming the pump to constantly be engaged in survival responses. Yeah? And that means that once we prime the pump, if we do get a trigger in our lives, this can then trigger some of these chronic illnesses that many of us may see, and many more as well. So these are the ones, the primary ones that we treat, but we have many people who've used the program for other conditions we couldn't possibly have imagined. So we have people contacting us saying we used it for MS, and actually we got big improvement. I'm speaking at the Alzheimer's Society Summit, and I never expected that that's what people are using it for. So this type of neuroplasticity approach is agnostic. It doesn't care what you're using it for. It's almost like the science of neurological shifts or neurological changes, because it models, I think, how we shift and change. And there's so many ways to rewire the brain. Yeah. But what we've tried to do here is create a systematic way based on the last 20 years of what we find is working for most people most of the time. Okay. So what I want to do is paint a picture of how these conditions may start. Yeah. So let's take the example of long COVID. So everyone's heard of long COVID here, I assume, yeah? Did you know in the US, 1 in 4 work absences right now is due to long COVID. It is the hidden pandemic of what's happened with this illness. And so in our hypothesis, what happens is you have the trigger, which is a virus, a bacterial infection, could be exposure to mold, yeah, it could be food poisoning, etc. So you have this external trigger. In terms of the internal trigger, it's often some kind of acute or chronic stress. Now, when we think of stress, we normally think of psychological stress, right? But stress can mean someone who's overworked, someone who's perhaps re-experiencing trauma, yeah, or adverse childhood experiences. It could be overtraining syndrome. So we treat a lot of people with athletes overtraining syndrome, where they've pushed their bodies too hard, which has weakened their immune system. So, number 1, the external trigger. Number 2, this acute or chronic stress. Yeah? And thirdly, we believe there could be some genetic factors that prime someone for this. So certainly adverse childhood experiences. We know that if you've had trauma, abuse, lack of nurture in childhood, you are 3 to 4 times more likely to get a chronic illness when you're older. Yep. So we can't avoid this link between what's happened in our past, the stress levels it's causing, and then what happens downstream, yeah, in our lives. Okay, so we've got these 3 factors, and I'll bring them up here so that we've got them here. You've got the predisposing factors, genetic, upbringing, acute or chronic psychological or physiological stress, a viral or bacterial or other trigger. So in this case, COVID-19 combined with all the stress of, first of all, people's lives are busy in general, plus the stress of the pandemic, right? So people, as soon as they get COVID, the anxiety surges in their body. Yep. So imagine you are the king or the queen of the castle. Yep. So you are the conscious, rational mind. You're the king or queen of the castle. Yep. And the castle has had a drought. So the castle is a little weak. And you've got an army and a navy to defend the castle and the kingdom. Yeah? But you're in a weakened state. Now, along comes an invading army over the hill. So what does your immune system and nervous system do? The army and the navy. It says, right, let's battle and let's fight off these invaders, right? So it fights off the incoming army. But because it was in a weakened state because of the drought, what do you think happens? They only just managed to fight off the invading army, right? So it leaves the army and navy a little traumatized. And they think, you know what? Our number 1 priority is saving the castle and the kingdom. Because if we don't, we'll be overwhelmed and overrun, and we won't survive. So anything that is even close to what happened when the army came over the hill, we must remain primed and ready. So now a little group of men comes over the hill. Right, the army and navy, they are ready. They get the battalions ready. They start shooting arrows. They start doing everything that they can to defend the castle against that potential invader. Yeah? So the brain errs on the side of caution. It says, let me be overprotective just to make sure. The army and navy, they're fighting off this incoming invader. Yeah? Now, anything that reminds it of what happened at the beginning when the army first came over the hill, the invading army, that also becomes what we call a conditioned stimulus. Yeah? A conditioned stimulus is something that you learn. So we all remember Pavlov's dogs. We've all heard of Pavlov's dogs. He rings a bell, the dog salivates. The bell has got nothing to do initially with having food, but it becomes associated with it. So if in the castle there was a red sky the night before the invading army came over the hill, the brain might say every time there's a red sky at night, that might mean an army comes over. So some completely neutral stimulus becomes an opportunity for the nervous system and immune system to get triggered. In a lot of work that we do, it tends to be stress, something that they haven't resolved, they haven't overcome. These patterns, these unconscious patterns in our minds that perhaps we haven't resolved, and through the different processes he does is to bring them up to conscious awareness so they can be released. That is a lot of personal development work. It's becoming aware of that which is unconscious, you can't drop what you don't hold. So we have to become aware of it, hold it, observe it with a calm, neutral mind, and then be able to release and let go. Yeah? So these conditioned patterns can trigger our immune system and nervous system, which is why stress and them can get wired together. You know, the idea that neurons that fire together wire together. Yeah? And then it leads to this vicious cycle. So now, each time the Army and Navy get recruited, they use up all the grains in the barns. They use up all the metal of the castle and the kingdom. So they're using up all the body's resources. Yeah? And how does this work in terms of this cycle here? And this is on my website, so don't worry about trying to look at it and really understand it. But basically, we believe there is trauma in two areas of the brain, the amygdala and insula, which I'll come on to, which are the Army and the Navy in some ways. So at number 4, it causes chronic sympathetic arousal, immune dysfunction, so triggering the immune system, yeah? HPA abnormalities, the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal gland, which some people interpret as what do they call it? Adrenal fatigue, leading to the symptoms at number 6, so that's the muscle dysfunction, the pain, the cognitive difficulties. And don't we find that people in our clinic, there's so many crossovers between the symptomatology that they are reporting with, right? How can that be? Yeah? It's because we are defining these illnesses based on the dominant cluster of symptoms. So if someone has a lot of pain, we call it fibromyalgia. But if they're more predominantly fatigue, we'll start calling it chronic fatigue syndrome. But actually, it's a spectrum. Yeah. And because the brain is on high alert and erring on the side of caution, it magnifies the signals coming back into the brain and says, what happens if this truly is dangerous? We should keep recruiting the Army and Navy to keep fighting no matter what, because we only just survived the last time. And so that doubles back into a hypersensitive brain, which then triggers the sympathetic nervous system and the immune system, creating this vicious cycle. And you can see at number 7, that can cause a secondary illness cycle, so the adrenal exhaustion, although there's questions about whether that actually truly exists and whether it's actually the HPA axis, which is where the downgrading actually occurs. Mitochondrial dysfunction. So many of you may have heard of the cell danger response, where the mitochondria are shifting the metabolism in the cells to protect, to warn, right? Now, is that localized or peripheral? Is that central? In our minds, there are constant feedback loops going on between the brain and the rest of the cells of the body in a sophisticated way to decide what the next steps are. Now, this is all a hypothesis, and so I want to be humble about, how I put this forward. But in our hypothesis, we believe that at the end of the day, the most upstream effect, despite all these feedback cycles, is probably in the amygdala and the insula. So all of the impressions and memories and experiences we've been through are like a photographic plate, so that when we look at the outside world, we're looking at it through this interpretive lens, this filter of what's going on in the world. Now, that's established in psychology, but what happens if this is also happening in our physiology, the way the brain perceives the body?